Así que vamos a saludar ya a Daniel Kral, is lead economist at Oxford Economics. Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Perfectly.
Fantastic.
With Trump's victory, Daniel, a lot of European countries are getting nervous in the next few minutes. We want to talk with you about the first economic in Europe, Germany. Tell us, how will Trump affect the German economy?
Well, it's important to set the context that the German economy has been one of the weakest performers in Europe since just before the pandemic. The economy has been flat. For example, the economy in Spain, but also other Southern European and East European countries have been growing very strongly since, but Germany has been flat. There are some structural and cyclical reasons to it. We can get on it. And part of the reason is that Germany has been hit by a series of shocks, the energy crisis, the inflation and interest rate shock, the dwindling sales in China as China moves up the value chain. And a lot of it has been compensated until now by stronger exports to the US. The US has been growing much more strongly than Europe. And as a result of the strong domestic demand in the US, it's pulled in imports from abroad. And a lot of it has been from Germany. So Germany now runs a very large trade surplus with the US. And as we know, President-elect Trump and the people that surround him are not very fond of countries that run very large surpluses with the US. So the risk there is that Germany is going to face tariffs on its exports to the US, which would further weaken the economy. I should also add that there is a strong trade component, and that's what we tend to focus on with the current US policy, with the incoming administration. But there's also a fiscal component where President Trump has promised very large tax cuts, a continuation of tax cuts and new tax cuts for businesses and households, which have the effect of stimulating demand. So that should be offsetting some of the impact of potential tariffs. And depending on the sequencing, if the fiscal stimulus comes first, that can actually in the short term benefit Germany as exports boom. And then the impact of tariffs is more gradual and phased in. It depends. There's also scope, I believe, for Germany or EU and the US, because obviously the EU is in charge of the trade policy for Germany and all member states, the EU Commission. I think there is a lot of scope to reach a deal on some quid pro quo, where we agree to buy more American, and in exchange the Americans back away from across-the-board tariffs.
You was talking about several problems in the German economy, energy crisis. You have mentioned also inflation. But in your opinion, what sectors in the German economy could suffer the most with the Trump's administration?
Well, I think the sector that's most at risk and which has underperformed the most recently is industry. If you look at industrial production in Germany, it's down by almost 20% compared to its pre-pandemic peak. The industrial production actually peaked already in 2017 in Germany. So the decline in German industry started even before the pandemic and the recent shocks that we've had. It really is more structural. And because the goods exports are from industry, various different sectors, chemicals, specifically cars. President Trump in the first administration was dissuaded from imposing tariffs on European car exports. Let's see if we're going to be that lucky this time, but that's a very sensitive sector for Germany. That's also seen a decline recently. So engineering companies, machinery, capital goods, all of the stuff that Germany is renowned for making, it runs a large surplus in all of these with the US. And in the case of tariffs across the board, these are the main ones that are set to suffer.
You have mentioned the car sector as very important for Germany. We can think about a few words. Trump saying he will protect the car sector in the United States. Do you think it will be the worst economic sector here in Germany, here in Europe, sorry? It will be the cars, or what would you think it will the worst sector?
Well, I think if you look at the campaign rhetoric, what President-elect Trump has promised is to impose across-the-board tariffs. So he hasn't singled out a specific sector or industry. He just said a blanket 10 or 20% tariff, depending on which speech you listen to, on all imports coming from Europe. Bear in mind, it's not just Germany that runs a large surplus with the US. It's the EU overall. We run a surplus of roughly $200 billion per year, which is around 1% of our EU GDP, so quite sizable. I would also add that the car sector in particular is sensitive. It's very politically sensitive, if you will. It's got a lot of lobbying power in the US as well as in the EU. And the problem that we have in Europe is also that we're facing much stiffer competition from China. Traditionally a large export market for German car manufacturers, whether from exporting cars made in Germany or cars assembled and sold in China directly. Now both of these are on the decline, largely because China has not only matched but often surpassed Germany, for example, in the electric vehicles, the vehicles of the future. China is now at the technological frontier, able to make much cheaper cars that drive longer, don't need to recharge as often, so has surpassed German technology in this. And as a result, the EU itself faces the risk of hollowing out of its automotive industry, not because of Trump's tariff, but also because of China's rise. And as we've seen this year, the EU has imposed countervailing duties or sort of new tariffs essentially on Chinese electric vehicles, driven by its concern of Chinese lack of level playing field, sizable subsidies from different parts of government, essentially unfair competition from China. So the car industry is kind of looking at to be squeezed from both sides, both from the rise of China, but also from potential impending tariffs from the US. The US has imposed even larger tariffs on Chinese vehicles of 100%. In Europe, they range from about 20 to 30%, so much lower. Essentially, the US wants to keep out all Chinese electric vehicles. In Europe, we have a more nuanced approach, but the risk is that maybe the US will just want to protect its auto industry from global competition overall and just put a big tariff barrier around it, preventing any imports from abroad.
Knal, you're mentioning the electric Chinese car sector. Trump's administration will apply tariffs to the European markets, but also, and more heavily, to the Chinese products. Do you think this could be positive in any way for Europe and the relationship between European Union and China?
So this is, as I said at the start, that there is scope to strike some deal with Trump to avoid blanket tariffs across European industries and exports. And I think China will be a big component of it. It will be Trump's insistence for us to align more closely with their China policy, to constrain China's technological imports, and to constrain China's rise. To an extent, this has already been happening under Biden. For example, he's put pressure on the European chip maker, well, not chip maker, but the machine, they make machines that make the chips, ASML, one of the most valuable European companies. And as a result of American pressure, ASML is now no longer selling the cutting-edge machines, the latest generation, to China, to prevent China acquiring this technology, which can then make chips, which can be dual use also for civilian, but also for military purposes. So this is a long-standing American policy, not really depending on what the administration is in. I guess the risk is here that Trump prefers more blunt policy instruments like tariffs, and alignment with that will be also, I think, a big part of the equation for Europe to avoid bigger tariffs. On your question whether Europe could benefit, so Trump has already launched a trade war when he was first time in office with China in 2018. And from the data that we've been looking at, we don't really see Europe benefiting much from the trade diversion that followed. It's really the economies around China and around the US that benefited from redirecting of the trade between China and the US. Essentially, Chinese companies setting up operations or rerouting their exports to US via the likes of Vietnam or Mexico. So we can see a declining share of imports from China in the US from 2017-18 onwards. But this is compensated fully by the rise in exports from the likes of Vietnam and Mexico. And these are the beneficiaries of the first trade war. Now, the situation may be different this time around if we have tariffs across the board, across countries, because in the first trade war it was largely about China and other regions where Europe faced some sectoral tariffs, but on sectors that account for very little trade. If we have across the board tariffs that affect all sectors and all countries, there's going to be limited benefit in rerouting the trade because everybody's facing the same.
This is not a very easy moment to the political front in Germany. So we are waiting now the following steps of Trump's administration. But what do you expect about the new German government and the response that they are going to give to Trump's politics?
Well, so the German government is on the verge of collapse. I believe there may be snap elections in early next year. There's still a vote of no confidence to be had in the parliament. In that case, we may see a new government, and we can speculate about the composition. In terms of the current government, because they are so disunited and hard to agree on anything, I think the baseline is essentially continuation of the status quo. Until a new government is formed from potential snap elections. When it comes to trade policy, importantly, it is the EU that speaks on behalf of all European countries. So I think it will be up to the European Commission to come up with a proposal for the US administration that will be attractive enough for them to engage with in terms of what we can offer them in return for them sparing us the worst of the tariffs. So it's really at this point not really up to the German government to avoid the worst. It's really down to the people in the trade portfolio, that have the trade portfolio in the new incoming EU Commission about how they're going to go about it.
Daniel, thank you very much for this conversation. We will follow with very interest this information about these topics. It's Daniel Kral, lead economist at Oxford Economics. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.